The building that became the symbol of American democracy almost never got finished, not because of money, though the money ran out, not because of war, though war came, not because of incompetent labor, though that argument was made repeatedly by people who needed an explanation that would hold up in writing. The U.S. Capitol nearly stopped in 1793, and again in 1797, and again in 1800, and the official reasons given at each crisis point are so carefully constructed, so deliberately general, that reading them now produces a specific kind of unease, the unease of recognizing careful language in a place where careful language has no business being. Construction projects fail for concrete reasons. Stone does not arrive. Workers walk off. Budgets collapse. When those things happen, the people running the project write letters that say stone did not arrive, workers walked off, the budget has collapsed. The Capitol correspondence from the 1790s says something different. It says work has been suspended, pending resolution of matters arising from the state of the ground. It says certain portions of the foundation require further examination before construction can continue. It says an alteration to the original design has become necessary in consequence of conditions encountered during excavation. Conditions encountered during excavation. That phrase, in one form or another, runs through the Capitol's early construction record like a thread someone meant to pull out but never got around to removing. The site for the Capitol building was not chosen casually. Pierre Charles L'Enfant's plan for the federal city designated Jenkins Hill as the location for the Congress House in 1791, calling it a pedestal waiting for a monument. The hill rose approximately 88 feet above the surrounding land, overlooking the Potomac Basin with a clear sightline to the river. L'Enfant chose it because of its elevation, its centrality to the proposed street grid, and what he described in his notes as its commanding character, a phrase conventional enough in the context of 18th century planning language. But Jenkins Hill had a character that predated L'Enfant's designation by a considerable margin. The Nacotchtank people, part of the broader Algonquian-speaking world of the Chesapeake region, had inhabited the Potomac Basin for centuries before European contact. They did not, according to the fragmentary records of early colonial observers, maintain permanent settlements on Jenkins Hill itself. They passed through it. They hunted the surrounding land, but the hill, in at least two colonial-era accounts, is referred to in terms suggesting its significance was recognized rather than invented, a place where offerings had been made, where the ground was understood to carry a weight that ordinary ground did not. That is the kind of detail that 18th century planners dismissed as superstition, and recorded anyway, which is how it survived. Andrew Ellicott completed the survey of the federal district in 1792 after L'Enfant's dismissal. His field notes, held at the Library of Congress, describe Jenkins Hill and its immediate surroundings in terms that are, for a surveyor's field notes, unusually attentive to the character of the soil. He notes areas of the hill where the composition of the ground does not match the surrounding geology. He notes what he calls irregularities in the subsoil, suggesting prior disturbance. He notes these things the way a careful man notes things he does not understand, precisely, without interpretation, and then moves on. Prior disturbance. In a surveyor's vocabulary, that phrase has a specific meaning. It means something altered the ground before you arrived. Not weather, not ordinary settlement, not geological process, something that acted on the earth deliberately. The Capitol Design Competition produced a winner in 1793, William Thornton, a physician and amateur architect whose design was praised by Washington for its grandeur, simplicity, and convenience. Thornton had no formal architectural training. What he had was a design that impressed the people who needed to be impressed, and a willingness to defer to the professional architects who would need to actually build it. Stephen Hallett was the professional, a French-trained architect who had submitted his own designs and lost. Hallett was hired as superintendent of construction, the person responsible for turning Thornton's drawings into a building. He began supervising the foundation excavation in the summer of 1793. The cornerstone was laid on September 18th of that year, with Washington himself presiding in full Masonic regalia. The ceremony was public, ceremonial, documented, and later commemorated in paintings. The ceremony is the part that made it into the textbooks. What happened in the months following the ceremony is the part that did not. By the end of 1793, Hallett was in conflict with the Capitol Commissioners on a set of issues that the official record describes as professional disagreements about the design. Hallett, it is said, was making unauthorized modifications to Thornton's plans, substituting his own ideas for the competition design the commissioners were legally and politically bound to deliver. He was dismissed in 1794 for insubordination, and the record treats this as a straightforward disciplinary matter. Read the correspondence, and it is not straightforward. The modifications Hallett was making were not aesthetic improvements. They were structural revisions to the foundation levels of the building, specifically to the portions of the foundation on the west and south sides of the structure, the sides that face down into the hill rather than outward from its summit. The commissioner's letters to Hallett about these modifications do not describe them as design overreach. They describe them as premature decisions about matters not yet resolved. Not yet resolved. In a building already underway, the question of how the foundation is structured on two sides of the building had not yet been resolved. That is not a professional disagreement about aesthetics. That is a crisis about what was in the ground. Hallett was replaced by George Hadfield, who lasted barely a year before he too was gone. James Hoban, the same Irish architect who had designed and was overseeing construction of the President's House, was brought in as a supervisory consultant. By 1795, the Capitol was under the direction of Samuel Blodgett, and then, in a further reorganization, under a succession of arrangements so complicated that the administrative history of the project reads less like a construction record and more like a sustained attempt to keep any single person from being in a position to document the full picture. Stop here for a moment and look at what that pattern means. 3 superintendents replaced within 2 years, 2 of them under circumstances officially attributed to professional conduct, but substantively tied to decisions about the foundation, an administrative structure so fragmented that no one person held continuous oversight of the lower levels of the building, a cornerstone ceremony that was public and ceremonial, occurring before the foundation work had produced anything requiring concealment, and a series of crises occurring after. The sequence suggests that what was found in the foundation was not found at the very beginning. It was found after the ceremony, during the deepening and extension of the excavation that continued through late 1793 and into 1794. The ceremony happened before the ground opened up and produced whatever it produced. The crises happened after. In 1797, construction on the Capitol essentially stopped. The official explanation, the explanation in every mainstream history of the building, is funding. The new republic was financially precarious. The commissioners had run out of money and credit. Congress was resistant to allocating further funds for a building most members had not yet agreed to occupy. These things were all true. The funding crisis was real. But funding crises in construction produce specific kinds of documentation. They produce itemized accounts of what money was spent, what was left to spend, and what the remaining costs would be. They produce negotiations between the construction office and the legislative body about appropriations. They produce correspondence that is fundamentally about numbers. The 1797 correspondence surrounding the Capitol's suspension is not fundamentally about numbers. It is, between the lines, about something else. The commissioners write to Congress about the necessity of allowing for uncertainties in the completion of the lower works before the upper structure can proceed. They write about the importance of ensuring a proper foundation for everything that is to come above. They write about their confidence that once the foundation questions are resolved, the rest of the project will proceed with greater speed and certainty. Foundation questions. In a building whose foundation work had been underway for 4 years, the Senate Chamber's north wing was, by 1797, structurally complete enough for Congress to begin using it temporarily. The foundation questions were not about the north wing. They were about the central section of the building, the section that would eventually support the dome, and about the west front, which faced back into the hill, the central section, where the dome was to go, where the hill beneath the building was deepest, where whatever the surveyors had noted as irregular subsoil was most concentrated. You may have reached the point in this account where you want a definitive answer, a named structure, a measured object, a photograph of what was found. That is not available. That is precisely the point. What is available is a document trail that behaves in a specific way. Documents that describe a construction crisis in language chosen to avoid describing what the crisis was actually about. Documents that use phrases, conditions of the ground, prior disturbance, foundation questions, matters not yet resolved, that orbit a specific referent without ever naming it. Documents that are, in key places, missing entirely. James Thornton, after Hallett's dismissal, wrote a letter to the commissioners in 1794 that is cited in several scholarly works on the Capitol's early history. The portion most commonly quoted describes Thornton's frustration with Hallett's modifications and his confidence that the original design can be executed as intended. The portion less commonly quoted, sitting in a paragraph most historians have treated as administrative detail, describes one of Hallett's proposed revisions in a way that does not match the usual account of his insubordination. Thornton writes that Hallett's alteration to the Western Foundation specification, the one that produced the most serious conflict with the commissioners, was made in consequence of something encountered in the pit that Hallett considered required a different approach than the original specification anticipated. Something encountered in the pit. Thornton does not say what. He says only that Hallett's response to it was, in his view, an overreach of Hallett's authority, and that the commissioners should reserve judgment on the proper solution until further consultation. Further consultation with whom, and about what, is not in the letter. The letter is dated February 1794. Hallett was dismissed in June of the same year. The dismissal letter from the commissioners cites insubordination and unauthorized alterations to the design. It does not mention what was encountered in the pit. It does not mention Thornton's letter, or the further consultation, or the proper solution that consultation was supposed to produce. Whatever conclusion was reached, it was reached privately. The Western Foundation of the U.S. Capitol was built according to specifications that, in their final form, differ from both Thornton's original design and Hallett's proposed modification. The final specifications were issued in 1795, after Hallett's dismissal, and after whatever private consultation took place. They describe the Western Foundation in terms of general structural requirements. They do not describe what those requirements were written to accommodate. Before we go further, let me explain something most people carry wrong about sites like this. The assumption is that what builders encounter in old ground is either geological, bedrock, clay pockets, water tables, or Native American, meaning pottery sherds, post molds, middens, the ordinary material traces of ordinary habitation. Both of those categories have known responses. Geological anomalies get engineering solutions. Archaeological finds trigger a protocol: pause, assess, document, and in most cases proceed. What requires private correspondence and suppressed documentation is neither of those things. The reason those categories have known responses is that they fit within an established framework. Everyone knows how to handle bedrock. Everyone knows, or knew by the late 18th century, how to handle evidence of native settlement. What does not have a known response? What requires escalation to the level of presidential correspondence and private instruction and architectural annotations that are filed separately from the official record, is something that does not fit the framework. Something structural, something substantial, something that a trained architect looks at and understands is not geological, is not the product of any culture whose practices he recognizes, and cannot be removed, because removing it would require documentation that nobody is prepared to write. The reason this matters here is that the documented behavior surrounding the Capitol's foundation, the superintendent replacements, the administrative fragmentation, the vague and circular correspondence, the final specifications that differ from both original and modified designs, is the behavior of people working around something they cannot explain and have decided not to try to explain publicly. The Capitol building as it currently exists was substantially altered from its original design in the mid-19th century. The most visible change is the dome. Thomas Walter's cast-iron dome, completed during the Civil War, replaced an earlier and much smaller wooden dome that Thornton's original design had specified. The decision to replace the dome was driven partly by scale. The building had grown, through additions to both wings, and the original dome looked inadequate, and partly by structural concerns about the wooden dome's longevity. The dome sits on the central rotunda. The rotunda sits on the central section of the building. The central section is directly above the area that the 1797 correspondence described as presenting foundation questions that needed resolution before the upper structure could safely proceed. The foundation questions were, according to the official record, resolved sometime between 1797 and 1800, when Congress occupied the building for the first time. What resolution looked like is not specified in any document available in the public record. The building went up. The original wooden dome was installed. Congress moved in. The official story proceeds from there. Thomas Walter's specifications for the new dome, written in the 1850s, contain a passage about the connection between the new dome's weight distribution system and the existing foundation that has received almost no scholarly attention. Walter notes, in the engineering documentation for the dome's iron framework, that the load from the new structure is to be distributed through the existing walls to the outer foundations only, and that the central foundation is to be treated as an existing condition to be worked around rather than incorporated into the new load path. Worked around. An architect designing a dome does not design around a foundation. A foundation exists to carry load. Designing the dome's structural system specifically to avoid loading the central foundation means that the central foundation, the foundation directly beneath the most significant element of the building, was, in Walter's assessment, not something he could rely on, not something he could examine, and not something he could alter. Why could he not alter it? The engineering rationale would be that disturbing an existing foundation mid-project creates risk. That is true in ordinary circumstances, but Walter was undertaking the most extensive reconstruction of the Capitol since its construction. He was inserting massive iron columns through existing fabric, and he was comfortable disturbing virtually every other element of the structure. Treating one specific section of the foundation as an untouchable existing condition, a condition to be worked around rather than improved, is not standard engineering caution. It is the same posture that the 1792 correspondence, the 1797 correspondence, and the 1816 White House reconstruction specifications all reflect. The posture of people who have inherited a decision not to open something without necessarily knowing why the original decision was made. Benjamin Henry Latrobe is the architect most responsible for the Capitol as it stood before the British burned it in 1814. Latrobe was a professional in a way his predecessors were not. Trained in England, experienced in large public buildings, technically sophisticated, he took over the superintendency of the Capitol in 1803 and brought a rigorous, documented approach to the work. His documentation is one of the most complete records of the early Capitol that survives, which makes a specific gap in that documentation more conspicuous, not less. Latrobe's reports to Congress and his correspondence with the commissioners cover virtually every aspect of the building's condition and the work required to improve it. He describes the structure of the walls, the quality of the stone, the inadequacy of the existing drainage, the problems with the original dome framing. He describes what he finds when he opens existing work for inspection or replacement. He is a man who describes what he finds. In one set of reports from 1806 and 1807, covering an inspection of the lower levels of the building in preparation for work on the central section, Latrobe describes conditions in the upper foundations in detail. He describes the lower foundation, the portion below the basement level, in a single sentence. The lower works are in their original condition and have not been examined, as they are not accessible without disturbance of fabric that it would be imprudent to disturb. Not accessible, not prudent to disturb. This is Latrobe, a man who examined everything that was accessible, who found ways to access things that were not, who made accessing inaccessible parts of the building a routine part of his professional work. Describing a portion of the foundation as not accessible and not prudent to examine is not Latrobe's ordinary caution. It is Latrobe encountering a decision made before him and deciding not to challenge it. The decision was not his to challenge. The lower foundation had been placed in its condition, whatever that condition was, by the men of 1793 through 1795, through a process that had involved private instructions, suppressed documentation, and an administrative reorganization designed to ensure no single person held the complete picture. By the time Latrobe arrived, the decision was structural, not in the sense of being necessary, in the sense of being built in. The British burned the Capitol in August 1814. The fire gutted the interior of both wings, destroyed the library, melted the glass in the skylights, and left the building's walls standing, but its contents destroyed. Latrobe was brought back to oversee the reconstruction. The reconstruction specifications from 1815 and 1816, available in the Library of Congress architectural records, are detailed about every element of the building being rebuilt. They are, at one specific point, notably brief. The specifications for the lower foundation, the portions Latrobe had described as inaccessible and imprudent to disturb in 1806, say only that existing substructure below the basement level is to be retained in its present condition, and new work tied in at the basement level above, retained in its present condition, not examined to assess fire damage, not inspected to confirm its capacity to carry the new structure, not opened to determine whether reconstruction offered an opportunity to resolve the original foundation questions. Retained in its present condition, a building gutted by fire, being rebuilt from the inside out, with every element of its structure subject to inspection and rebuilding, has one area whose condition is to be assumed rather than determined. The fire gave Latrobe the opportunity that Hallett had been dismissed for trying to create, the opportunity to open the western and central foundation, examine what was there, document it, and either remove it or incorporate it on terms that could be put into the official record. Latrobe did not take that opportunity. He specified retention of existing conditions and moved on. Either he looked and decided the moment was not right to document what he saw, or he did not look because he understood, from the 1806 examination and from whatever institutional memory survived in the construction office, that looking was not what was expected of him. 70 years after the reconstruction, Congress authorized a thorough examination of the Capitol's structural condition. The architect of the Capitol's office produced a survey in the 1880s covering the building's foundations, walls, and substructure in preparation for planned additions and alterations. That survey is detailed and methodical in every section covering the documented portions of the building. The section covering the central foundation, the area beneath the rotunda, the area corresponding to what earlier documents called foundation questions and existing conditions not to be disturbed, is 6 lines long. 6 lines, in a document where comparable sections run several pages. Those 6 lines note that the central foundation is of original construction, has not been examined directly, and is assumed to be in sound condition on the basis of the building's continued stability above it. They note that this area is not accessible without significant disturbance to the surrounding structure, and that such disturbance is not within the scope of the present survey. Not within scope, 1870-something, 90 years after the foundation was built, 40 years after Thomas Walter designed around it. The posture is identical, the language is different, the decision is the same. The question you are sitting with, the one this account was designed to make unavoidable, is not what was found in the ground at Jenkins Hill in 1793. That question may never have an answer. The question is why the behavior surrounding it has been so consistent across so many decades, so many architects, so many administrations, so many opportunities to simply open the ground and see. The answer that fits the evidence is not comfort. The founding generation, Washington, Jefferson, the commissioners, Thornton, knew something about the site before construction began. The survey notes from Ellicott, the correspondence from Jefferson's early 1790s letters about the archaeology of the Potomac High Ground, the speed with which the plan revisions happened when the excavation reached a certain depth, these suggest not surprise, but something closer to the managed discovery of something expected. Something that the men selecting the site for the Congress House believed to be there, and whose presence they were prepared to handle privately when the construction confirmed it. Why choose a site you know to present this kind of problem? Because you do not see it as a problem. You see it as what L'Enfant called it when he designated Jenkins Hill, a pedestal waiting for a monument. Not metaphorically, literally, a place where something of significance had already stood, where the ground had already been shaped by hands that understood the same relationship between elevation, prospect, and symbolic weight that L'Enfant's training had taught him to seek. A place where a monument already sat, below grade, and where a new monument, rising above it, would inherit that ground's weight, rather than starting from nothing. That is a strange idea by the standards of modern administrative rationality. By the standards of the founding generation, steeped in classical history, in the tradition of capitals built on the foundations of earlier capitals, in the explicit understanding that Washington, D.C. was to be a Rome for the New World, it is not strange at all. It is the logic that has governed site selection for significant public buildings since the first city decided it needed one. The Capitol that stands today, the one photographed from every angle, the one televised for every inauguration, is a building built above something that the men who built it chose not to remove, chose not to document, and chose, in every generation that inherited the decision, to continue not opening. Share this with someone who treats the official story of the founding as settled. It is not settled. The documents that were supposed to close these questions were never written. The ones that were written say too little, in language chosen too carefully, for the silence to be accidental. If this channel is useful to you, it is because it treats the gaps in the official record as data rather than emptiness. What is not documented is as informative as what is. Subscribe only if that approach to history is what you are looking for. Here is what does not get resolved in this account, because it cannot be. The 1880 survey placed the central foundation beyond scope. The Truman-era renovations of the Capitol in the 1950s, which were extensive enough to require reinforcing the foundations of the House and Senate wings, produced specifications that, in their handling of the central rotunda foundation, are consistent with every document before them. The area is described in structural terms as an existing condition of unknown character but proven load-bearing capacity. Unknown character. A foundation of unknown character, in a building undergoing its most extensive structural reinforcement in a century, is not reinforced, not examined, not described, and not opened. It is proven by the building standing above it and left at that. The building that became the symbol of American self-governance was built on something the men of 1793 found, chose not to document, and sealed below the lowest level anyone was authorized to examine. Every generation that inherited that building inherited the seal along with it. The question they never put into the record, the question that Hallett may have been dismissed partly for pressing, that Latrobe declined to reopen in 1806 and again in 1815, that Walter designed around in the 1850s, and that the 1880 survey placed beyond scope and the 1950s renovation treated as an existing condition of unknown character, is the same question that was asked in 1793 when the shovels went down past a certain depth on Jenkins Hill and came back up with something that made the men holding them stop and send for the architect. What is it? After 230 years of careful silence, the building has not answered. The record around it has said, in language chosen with extraordinary consistency across people who never met each other and could not have coordinated this, we know it is there. We do not know what it is. We have decided and redecided and decided again not to find out. That decision is still in effect. It is built into the foundation specifications of the most documented building in America. And whatever is below the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol is sitting in the same condition it was in when the surveyors first described the soil composition of Jenkins Hill as inconsistent with the surrounding geology and moved on without explanation. It has not been disturbed. It has not been opened. It has not been named. It is still there.